You've landed on The Substance, a podcast aimed at being biblical, thoughtful, and human. Join us each week as we engage the culture without the culture war. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken, here with my two co-hosts, Philip Marinello.
Hey, everybody.
And Vincent Edwards.
How's it going?
And joined by special guest this week. You might know her as the notorious KSP, Karen Swallow Pryor.
Hello.
Welcome to The Substance, Karen.
Thank you for having me.
Karen is an author and a professor of English and Christianity and culture at Southeastern, and most known, I would say, for just talking about and promoting in her lectures and in her class and in her writing the importance of reading well. Karen, your book on reading well specifically, I would just love to hear, just kind of as a starting point, how did that specific project come to be? What led up to that?
Yeah, so my first book was Booked Literature and the Soul of Me, kind of a personal literary memoir, kind of published by an independent publisher, not that well known, but it's the story of my life growing up as a Christian and growing up in the church, but loving literature and the life of the mind and not really seeing how those two things could go together. And so when I wrote that book, it's almost 10 years ago. I was teaching and writing in a context where I was really trying to encourage Christians to read more, to read better things and to read widely and not be afraid of reading non-Christian works and to read classic literature and to read bad literature and just read widely. Borrowing a term from the 17th century Puritan poet John Milton, who talked about books promiscuously read. And then
very edgy.
Very edgy.
Scandalous.
We're in a very different time just a few years down the road, and we're inundated with lots of things to read, whether it's just on social media or blog posts. And so people are reading things all the time, and Christians also, I think, are reading very widely, but not very with much discernment or reading very well. And so this seemed like the next logical step for me to take is, first I was arguing, well, let's read widely. And now all of a sudden I'm saying, okay, well, yeah, let's read widely, but let's read well. And so that was the starting point of the book. And then it just kind of evolved into a more formal examination of the classical virtues in that context. That wasn't something I set out to do, but that's kind of what happens when you write a book. You research and it takes shape. And so the book really is about works of literature, but also developing virtue in what and how we read.
Yeah, I found it to be very much like one part literary criticism, but almost another part moral philosophy.
Yeah.
And I found myself really enjoying that.
Oh,
well,
good.
I also appreciated equal parts like literary advocacy. One of the things you mentioned in either your preface or your opening chapter was the fact that many Christians are nervously prone to a censoring spirit, and that's something that I feel like I understand the good motivations behind that, but ultimately I think it does kind of leave us as a handicap. What do you think is behind that impetus, and what does that do well and poorly? Just the idea to kind of protect ourselves from things.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of, I've considered myself to be pretty empathetic and I have a good imagination, but some things are just harder for me to understand, and that is one of them. And I think that's just because I grew up reading so many things and really benefiting from that curious mind and examination and different perspectives, and it's made my faith stronger. But I think that there's of course, the Bible talks about, whatever is lovely and true and of good report, think on these things. And of course, we want to do that. Of course, I think we have a narrow definition of what's true and what's of good report. And this question, we could talk for an hour about this question. I'll try to rein myself in. But we also there's sort of there is a long history of anti-intellectualism within the evangelical movement. That's well documented. So there's that
Fundamentalism
strain,
right there.
whether we realize it or not. And then there's just sort of the natural and good caution about exposing ourselves to darkness and bad things. And then we're also, it's just part of our culture, part of the culture wars, part of it. We have so many unexamined assumptions that if we just hear something like, oh, we shouldn't read this, or we shouldn't be exposed to this, we assume it's true without thinking about, well, what is this category that we should stay away from? And maybe we're involved in some category confusion or some overlap, or we don't know why there are things that we should avoid and why other things are not in that category. So it just becomes part of the culture and something that we don't think about. And we're just not really trained in how to read and what we can gain from good literature, as opposed to just sort of, the pop Christian stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
And I know in growing up myself, I grew a passion for books because I had to sneak to read them. Because I think that anti-intellectualism was, like you said, Phil, built around fear. And so at one time I had a book about how a guy who was a devout and very studied Muslim became a Christian. And my mom saw, and it said Islam. So get it, don't read it. And I was like, wait, but I think it's really good. So I can definitely understand, because I think the motivation behind that is it truly is to say, maybe a person doesn't have discernment. Maybe a person won't be able to differentiate between some of the content in that without that wisdom. Then you could fall into, some kind of trap. So I definitely understand that.
And I think, from years of teaching, I've just seen that, especially teaching in a conservative Christian environment, I've seen how that good tendency to protect can backfire, and that when young people are exposed to ideas later on that they haven't had the chance to face and grapple with, they feel duped or deceived, or as though they were blindsided, and they get angry or bitter or resentful. I mean, I've just seen so many people kind of go to the other extreme when, again, as I argue in my book, when talking about virtue, we should avoid the vices of excess and deficiency. So it doesn't mean blindly accepting everything and reading garbage. And I'm not talking about just like the content, but even just the form of literature that's garbage because it's easy or cheesy or just kind of slimy, like the Lifetime television version of literature. And I hope I didn't hurt anybody's feelings, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book on Reading Well, you talk about the virtue of reading and how it requires attentiveness and patience and prudence and temperance. So how do you encourage someone who has never taken the time to deeply and intentionally read? How do you encourage that person to take on that virtue?
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the beginning, things have changed so much in just a few years, and the things that are competing for our attention, and I speak of myself here. I mean, social media, our Apple phones that are, programmed to keep us engaged and keep us coming back for clicks and likes. That is just so different from the world that I grew up in, where we didn't have that kind of competition. So anyone who is listening and thinking, I don't, what you just said, and doesn't know how to begin, or is frustrated and struggling, please know that the struggle is real for all of us, including English professors. And so I think it's just something we really have to be intentional about. And so whether that means, just kind of developing habits, which are, that's the basis of virtue, is a practice that becomes a habit that then becomes so second nature that it's actually a virtue that we possess. So it might be just committing 15 or 20 minutes a day of uninterrupted reading from a book. And and not just like a self-help book or
Yeah.
but something that require, I'm a big fan of fiction and novels, good ones, but something that requires sustained attention over a long period of time, because everything else that's in our culture is anti that. So this is kind of a way of stretching ourselves in a different direction. And I would even, there's a lot of cognitive research. Some of it I mentioned very briefly in the book, but a lot of it is showing, like, when we're on our screens and we're using Twitter or Facebook or reading blogs or even just using a laptop to read long form material, we're actually using a different part of our brain. So it's just like anything else, any other part of our body that we would want to exercise or strengthen. We actually have to be intentional about strengthening a different part of our brain that has that long-term memory and that sustained attention, because that really is a virtue. The things that we pay attention to shape our character and our lives in ways that we just, we really need to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
So that a very simple way is to just build a practice where you're dedicating time to reading something, even if it's going to take you a couple of months to read a thick novel, or a couple of weeks to read a thinner one, something that requires that sort of commitment on your part to engage for a while, even if it's a little bit each day. And also the other key thing, because this also is counter everything else that we tend to do throughout the day, is to read slowly. We are so used to speed reading, whether it's an email or a blog post. When we pick up, good literary writing, again, whether it's fiction or, or something, theological or philosophical, and not even, it doesn't have to be very deep, but just something thoughtful and well crafted. We should be paying attention. We should be pausing and thinking about a word choice or sentence structure. It's not a race. We're not trying to speed through. And there are some things we should just, read quickly to get the information. But the kind of readings, and maybe,
For sure.
yeah. But when we're trying to develop that very literary mind, which is and should be the mind of the people of God, then
that is how God revealed himself to us.
Exactly. And I think most Christians who are, Bible-centered people get this when it comes to the Bible. We have been discipled well in terms of, like, reading. We read the Bible, we read verses, we read chapters we read the whole thing in a year. We read it again. We never say that we should not read it again or that we should speed through it, I hope. And so the Bible is a literary text, a rich literary text. It's more than that, but it is that. And so we can actually practice some similar skills that we apply to Bible reading to other wonderful literary texts, and it works those same kinds of muscles, so we can go back to the Bible, back to reading our Bible with those strengthened skills.
Well, and that makes me, I really appreciate it in the book, just your affirmation of the fact that dedicating time specifically to reading in and of itself is a virtue. A lot of what I read typically is nonfiction. And one of the things that I wanted to do this year was to read more fiction. And I was like, oh, this is affirmative and nice, but it makes sense. Like, if you want to exercise, I say, like, buy a gym membership. Getting good books and setting aside time regularly to read has to be the first step. But so the Christian tradition is very rich as far as, like, intellectual excellence and things like we're striving to understand God well in the way he has revealed himself. Where is kind of the disconnect of the intellectual rigor that goes into understanding scriptures to literary disciplines and understanding the rest of life?
Yeah, I talked about the anti-intellectual tradition and evangelicalism, and I really want to be fair that it's not just in the church. I mean, this is the culture. This is the larger culture that, this is what the middle and late modern age consists of, is, just this trajectory toward easier and faster and more automated and more like an assembly line. I mean, that's just the trajectory of modern life. And so it's not just Christians who fill their minds with, junk food and are on Twitter. It's everyone. So so this is just part of the culture. And it's there are lots of things. I don't want to present sort of an idealized romantic image of the past, because we go back a few hundred years when writers and statesmen were reading Greek and Latin and writing epics and so forth. Well, yeah, but it was only a few of white men, and
the richest and whitest.
Yes,
of men.
exactly. So now with democracy, God bless democracy, this kind of educate, everyone's not reading Greek and Latin, but at least everyone can read English. So there's sort of a diffusion of education throughout the population, and so we don't have that rigid distinction between upper class and lower class, and that's good. But it also means that as a church and as Christians in culture, we need to think about what it means to be countercultural in some different ways than what we usually hear about. There are lots of ways we can be countercultural, but we don't often think about what it means in terms of our minds, and just this sort of dumbing down that has been taking place, for a couple hundred years. So it's a larger cultural problem, and we just, we need to be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned in your book too some of these broader trends where it's kind of this generalized like self-help deism that happens in evangelicalism. But even churches that are more like the tradition that we come from, and 40-minute sermons, verse by like we're picking up next verse, we're trying to take things in context, we're talking about the structure, we're talking about the genre, you're coming back week after week, it's in the text, you're trying to apply it, right? And it attracts a kind of intellectual rigor, but somehow in the midst of all this intellectual pursuit, it seems like a lot of these Christians are missing developing that prudence. So you see a lot of like anti-knowledge of self and a lot of just lack of understanding of the world because they're kind of in this cloister, it seems like. So how is that happening? How are you having a faith tradition that's so rooted in this kind of intellectual pursuit of faith, an accident in that, but missing the development of intellectual virtue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I'm not a trained moral philosopher, but of course I did study it for this book, and it's just been a hobby of mine. So I'm not an expert, but expanding on what I talked about in the book and didn't get into this. I mean, basically in the classical tradition, they talk about the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues, the way that we might talk about that in sort of, 21st century American evangelical ease, we might talk about the heart and the head. And I think, we can easily look at almost any church, a particular church or a tradition, and see that there's often, because we are not virtuous people, and virtue is so hard to attain, we do tend to veer toward one or the other. So we might have a tradition that veers toward the heart, and they have a lot of knowledge, or toward, I'm sorry, that would be the head, or the heart that's just more emotional and about affection, and really the virtuous approach is to balance both of those, and so I think though in that tradition that focuses on the head, there's a lot of knowledge, but that knowledge is not necessarily wisdom, and it's certainly not prudence, which is, as I talk about in the book, prudence is a form of wisdom. It's practical wisdom. So it's like we can be wise theoretically. Prudence is when you put that wisdom into action. And so in the church context, that would mean, to kind of pull a couple of threads of this conversation together, that would mean that, a church in my community that serves my community well is not going to deliver exactly what I want, because, I've got a PhD, I'm really interested in literature, I've read a lot. Well, that a church church should not be for me. So prudence in that context is you kind of trying to find that balance where you are discipling people, people at a high level, but you're also, discipling sort of the masses. To go back to, we talked about, we have education that's available to everyone. It's not teaching Greek and Latin because you can't teach Greek and Latin in 8th grade and teach everyone. So it's that balance and that prudence that is based on culture, and that's not relativism. It's just acknowledging that for whatever reason, when God created us for his pleasure and glory, he could have put us in eternity right away, but he chose to put us in this earthly realm where we are, experience existence in time and in place. And so culture is part of all that. So for whatever reason, he has given us culture, which varies, to be sort of the crucible through which we are saved and sanctified. And so culture is part of his plan. And so that's something we need to take seriously. We need to know our culture and know our time and know what it means to be a Christian in that time. And that's what I tell myself and remind myself when I think in the past few weeks what a terrible time it is to be a Christian. I'm like, well, but God put us here at this time and place for a reason. So that's what we've got to be here for. So anyway,
that's right.
Wow, that was long and winding.
No, that was
good.
That was excellent.
Phenomenal.
So, Karen, looking at your table of contents and the various books that you highlighted to show forth the various virtues, the one that caught my interest the most was you mentioned silence. I've kind of grappled with it myself. How would you encourage Christians? You mentioned that they should read stuff like Silence and challenging things as parable rather than doctrine. Can you talk about that dichotomy and why one is preferable?
Yeah. And again, this goes back to when I was talking about reading bad literature that's bad because of its form, not just its content, although you can't really separate those. So what I mean by that is like literature that doesn't really have any challenge. And by the way, let me also just say, just like eating candy, it's perfectly fine to read, dumb literature. Like when I go running, I listen to really bad suspense. Well, sometimes I turn them in on Audible because they're so bad, but I still enjoy a good Stephen King saga on my runs.
Sure.
Actually, he's a good writer for what he does.
I was like, wow.
Well, not like genre.
Genre, right.
Yeah. The form, yeah.
So when we're talking about silence is challenging on both levels. Its content is challenging because it's extremely challenging. And
it's hard to engage.
The book, if you haven't read it yet, its form is very challenging too because it's told with different narrators and different narrators' perspectives. So then the movie doesn't quite capture that, although it's a very wonderful film. And so those are two things. And anyone who's wanting to pick up a good literary work and be challenged, they would want to know this about this novel, that it's both the story and the way the story is told that are challenging. But for Christians, I think the content is, first of all, it's written by a Catholic writer about 17th century Catholics. And so the theology is very Catholic. And, if you're Baptist like me, then that's that's very challenging. So, and it's written, it's this kind of culture war mentality that is in this novel set in 17th century Japan is something that's we grapple with today too. But the center of the story really is about, for in more Baptist terms, is can you lose your salvation? How far can you go? And do you lose your salvation? Then the novel and the film really don't answer it super clearly. So that's the hardest part of all. But it causes us to. We don't have to, going back to your question about a parable versus like a morality tale, we don't have to agree with what we think the novel is saying. And we don't even have to be sure we know what the novel is saying, because I'm not positive either. But it raises such important questions that we should be asking ourselves, theologically and just personally. These are questions that we really need to wrestle with. So that novel is a great example of the kind of wrestling that we need to do, and the kind
Karen,
of challenges.
People want to know what Silence's worldview is so that they can know whether or not they can
agree
they
with
can
it or
expose
disagree
themselves
with
to
it.
it.
Right?
Yeah,
Without
exactly.
without
If they
being-
can, let
theological
them and their
mark.
family read it.
Oh boy.
So, Karen, you talk about in your book on reading well about such a commitment to reading and the depth in reading. So would you qualify audiobooks in the same way? And would that kind of engagement, having an audiobook or someone who's more akin to audiobooks, would that engagement require anything different?
So that's a good question. And I've seen a little bit of research about audiobooks that indicates that, and I may not be using the right terms here, but that audiobooks do kind of get into that, you work that long-term memory part of the brain, the back or part of the brain rather than the frontal lobe in a similar way that reading print books does. And I think it is reading. Now, I've been a reader for such a long time and need that visual and also like a pen in my hand so I can underline, that I've actually in the past few years when I started listening to audiobooks, I'm still developing those skills. So at first I had to listen to like really easy things because I just, I just need to develop the skill, and now I can listen to a little bit more complicated things. And I do know a lot of people who listen to. I still don't understand how you can multitask. Like I'm not sure those people who say they're listening to audiobooks while they're doing this or that are really doing the kind of reading that you would do if you were just sitting there listening to it and not doing other things. Because again, it does have to do with, I think, attention. And there's lots of science out there showing that there really is no such thing as multitasking, that we're actually, we're doing one thing for a split second and then another thing for a split second. So short answer is, yes, it is. You're exposing yourself to long narratives that are well-crafted, hopefully words in a linear form that take some time to get through, as opposed to a blog post or a tweet or a podcast, which podcasts are great, but they're not
different function.
Yeah. They're not crafted, and they aren't. So I think it's fine, but again, I still think, and I'm old school this way, like sitting with a book in your hand and a pen and a marker or a notebook or whatever, and just kind of having that tangible, embodied, incarnational experience with the word, I think is good.
Yeah.
No, you're for sure talking my language on that
That's
one.
my favorite too.
I listen to audiobooks that are either like nonfiction, Christian living, or business.
So I just listened to your book on audiobook too, so hopefully that was the right thing to do.
that one definitely counts. Yes.
For sure.
I would not be able to listen to. I don't think I could listen to my book on. That would be a book I would need to underline and so forth. So
because you can't go back.
I need to go back.
You can hit the 10 or 15 seconds back, but you can't go and reread lines and kind of savor, you can't savor a paragraph. Like, I crank audiobooks as far as like personal development and nonfiction stuff because they're about the ideas, but like
not the language.
Beautifully written piece of fiction. Like, I'm reading through Marilyn Robinson's Gilead books again this year because of Jack, and I was like, well, there is an audiobook, but I don't think I want to add that. I think I'll just reread the physical books.
And I got to return in print to that chapter on prudence. And there was a line you were writing, I don't remember in which chapter it was, but it might have been on temperance, about concise writing. And you wrote that line on concise writing in a very concise way. And I could tell it was intentional.
Yay!
And I was like, nice work.
good eye.
That's a lit professor right there.
Nice. So I'm sure we've got folks listening to it thinking, okay, I want to do that. And so for that listener now who's saying that's going to be maybe my new commitment now for 2021 is to try to do this, what's the starter pack? What's the KSP reading starter pack to get somebody into it? I mean, obviously it's different for different people,
right?
But what would you recommend?
Like moderately challenging but rewarding, but not like too high level.
True confessions here. This is one story with two confessions.
Okay.
Now remember, my specialty is British literature. So, and I still haven't read all the British literature in the world, obviously, but so American literature is something I'm trying to catch up on. So I actually read East of Eden for the first time in my life this summer.
Wow.
And actually I listened to it on Audible. And because it was, I don't want to say it was easy, but Steinbeck is amazing. And that story was so riveting and so pulled me in that I think East of Eden even though it's a thick, you might look at it and think, oh, this is thick, it's long. East of Eden is a great book to start because it's very literary. It's not hard. And also, bonus for any Christians, lots of biblical allegory there. Like they're retelling sort of like the biblical stories from the Old Testament. I mean, it's not like a complete retelling, but lots of those archetypes that we find in the biblical narrative over there. And it's fun to kind of just go, oh, that's like Cain and Abel. Oh,
nice.
So that's a great book. My personal favorite, well, I have a few, but one of them, I happen to have a new edition coming out in March with my own introduction and annotations and discussion questions, is Jane Eyre. And I want to say that Jane Eyre is not like a girly story, even though it's about a woman. It really is the story of
it's intense.
It's
like Victorian noir almost.
It's real. It's just so wonderful. And it is sort of an allegory of the soul. And it's a Christian heroine who's resisting the temptations to not live according to her Christian ethics. And also the temptation that I think is a little bit more real for all of us in the Christian world. And that is the temptation to do the Christian thing that is not the Christian thing for you. Like, I don't want to give too much away, but there are lots of ways to be a good Christian, lots of roles you can take on, lots of stations you can take in life, and different choices that you can make, and they're all would be honoring and pleasing to God, but they might not be the one that He's really fitted you for. And this is the story of a young girl who's facing like the moral temptations that we all face, but also the higher level ethical decisions, like what did God call me to do, as opposed to what did He call my neighbor to do? Because we do a lot of copying our neighbors, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that novel is just wonderful.
I need to read that.
Man.
Well, read it with my introductions with published with B&H. 2 were out last year, 2 in March, 2 more next year. No spoiler introductions. They're really designed to equip you and help you to know what to look for as you're reading and know the background without giving any of the fun plot events away.
Nice. And that kind of material and guidance is so helpful. I remember just interacting with my wife as she was getting her English Lit degree and going through things and revisiting stories that I saw in school, but just either because I wasn't paying attention or because the way it was taught. I just remember like finding out that a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court was actually satirical on the whole idea of our progress and our modern society being superior. So that just blew my mind. Like, oh, they can do that. The narrator, you can read them and they can lie to you. Okay,
that changes everything.
Yeah, that just blows my mind. And so but I think when you learn to read with a critical eye that way, it opens up so much of the Bible because, like you said, like I think we are people of the book, and we tell people to go back into it. But the reality is too, we're a lot more comfortable in Paul than we are in Moses or in David, in the Psalms
or Ecclesiastes, right? Like, how do you take
or Ecclesiastes, whoever the author of Ecclesiastes was, and
is that gonna be a running joke on the substance?
Eternal joke there.
Tripper Longman, help us out.
Boy.
But yeah, so much of the Bible is narrative, and I've kind of had this thought experiment, right? Because God is sovereign over all space and time, and so in a sense, He has organized even the development of societies, and so there is no necessary requirement based on history necessarily that God gave us a book, right? I think about Exodus 34. Moses asked God, "Show me your glory." He says, "I'm going to make all my goodness pass before you, and I'm going to proclaim my name." And then he goes on, he describes himself, very quoted. Echoes of that happen throughout the narrative of Scripture. And so God could have chosen I don't know, God could have created us in some sort of weird futuristic land where like He revealed Himself through hologram or video or whatever. But He chose a book. Why do you think He did that?
Yeah, isn't that is the coolest thing? I talk about this all the time in my classes. I'm like, he didn't, he didn't choose to reveal Himself through like a mathematical formula or, like you said, or a hologram or something. No, and of course we don't know, but there is something, there's something about the word, both verbal and written, that it's revealed in time. So like it's like a painting. You go to a museum and you look at a painting and you take it all in and you observe the details. But it's still that's a spatial experience, because you can look over here, you can look over there, you can look at this. But language occurs in time, like one letter or one, depending on whether you learned whole language reading or phonetics or whatever, but it's still revealed in time, a syllable, a morpheme at a time, and we read one word at a time. And so there's something about the nature of language that replicates our experience as human beings in time on this earth. And there's also Neil Postman, in his really important book. It's old, it's simple, it's not simple. It's written for a popular audience. It's profound, but anyone can and should read it. Amusing Ourselves to Death. There's a famous passage in the introduction early on, and he's writing it as a secular Jew, right, who started out as a progressive liberal, became more conservative over time, but he wasn't a Christian, wasn't really religious, but he wrote about how the oddity of God's commandment not to make any graven images. And he talks about how the God of the Old Testament was revealing Himself so differently than all of the other small g gods and the pagan cultures that were surrounding the Israelites, and telling them that He was going to reveal Himself through this sort of abstraction of the word rather than the immediacy of the image. And that's really what his whole book is kind of about the difference between a print culture that thinks in a linear way versus an image-laden culture. And so there's just so much significance in that. And then, of course, we know that it's not just that, because God is a model of virtue, and He always sort of balances these things out, because we know also that the word is Christ. Christ, the word became flesh.
That's right.
And so there's that aspect to that embodied presence that is beyond just words on stone tablets or words on a scroll or on a book. It's not one or the other. It is both. So.
So one of the questions when I reached out to you to do the show, I said, hey, like, you've done a ton of press and you do podcasts all the time. is there anything that you would be interested in talking about? Like, well, there's a couple things that I've never been asked, so I've got your question for
and
you, Karen.
I remember you asking that, and I remember answering, but I don't remember what I said, so this is going to be fun.
Oh,
Surprise.
excellent. So,
I'm going to surprise
Fan of the
myself.
show, KSP sent this in.
Karen, what is the hardest lesson that you've ever learned?
Oh, I said that. What is the hardest lesson? I said that no one had ever asked me that. I really did do this. I just, my life is a blur. What is the hardest lesson that I've ever learned? Wow, I must have been like really emo that day. What was I thinking when I said that? What is the hardest lesson I ever learned? Yeah. You guys all thought I was all prepared for this. Maybe I didn't even have an answer.
This is a conversation. This isn't a lecture.
I probably didn't have. I was just like, well, nobody ever asked me that before.
I can give you another prompt.
Okay, give me another prompt. Yeah. Give me another.
Okay, let me set this up. Karen, what are some fears and weaknesses that you have?
Oh, yeah, I do remember that. What was I? I remember when I was writing that. I'm like, why am I writing this? I don't want to go on the radio. Some fears and weaknesses that I have. I do. I think that I do have some pride. Well, we all do. But I think I don't like to be wrong, and it's not like I have. I think it depends on what it's about. Maybe. I think there are things that I don't have a great deal of pride in being right about. But I definitely, I have a hard time. I think this manifests mainly on social media, where I feel this need to respond to everybody, like every troll. Like I just need to one up them. And I don't know why that is, but I do think that I think maybe it just, I don't want to be seen as weak or something. And so that, I mean, that's a small, like that's a manifestation of it. But then I can take that and go, oh, you know what? I don't like to be weak at all, like in real life and in my relationships. I don't want to be dependent or weak. And, probably most of us don't, but that can go to an extreme. So
sure, that's a very natural human thing, but definitely something we want to be on top of and keep in check.
Yeah, it's interesting for someone when you're studying character, right, and you see weakness and vulnerability and those kind of things to get to know them. It maybe is harder to put yourself out there as an example in a vulnerable person, in that way.
Because you're real.
And then because the flip side of that is vulnerability has become kind of like a commodity, in the social media age. So there's a way of sort of a fake vulnerability. I think, I think what I'm talking about is kind of like a real one.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think that's probably a human thing.
Yeah. I saw somewhere somebody say like transparency is not the same as vulnerability.
Ooh, that's good.
Oh, that is good. Yeah.
That's a good tweet right there, Jeff.
Oh, it's somebody else's.
All right, Karen, couple rapid fire questions here. We really appreciate the time you've given us. Got a couple of good questions from listeners that we're going to throw at you real quick. One, what is a book, and you can give a couple if they come to your mind, what is a book that you think is undervalued or gets a bad rap and kind of dunked on, but one that really everybody should read in your opinion?
Oh, wow. I do a lot of the dunking, so I have to think about one. That's a good question. I know this is like a nerdy answer, but a lot of people do dunk on Charles Dickens. And
really?
Yes, they do. And Charles Dickens was
like the Tale of Two Cities.
He was very popular in his time, and he does kind of write to the masses, sort of. And there's some sentimentality and a little bit of.
Well, he was like a serial writer, right? Didn't he like come out? He wrote his books in chapters.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of poo-pooing of Charles Dickens, but I just think he's just delightful. He was kind of he was a jerk too, but he was very full of himself and very cruel to his wife. But
if the Lord gives me a full life, he's one that I think I would like to read through most of his stuff eventually.
Yeah, he would be worthwhile. Yeah.
So why don't we flip it, since you're the one who always does the dunking?
Uh-oh.
What
Why don't we
shouldn't
do that
people
too?
read?
Yeah, what's overvalued and should get a bad rap?
And be
Oh,
replaced
God.
with Dickens.
Yeah.
I get into, this isn't a secret, but every time I say it, I feel bad because I hurt people's feelings and then I get trolled on
Uh-oh.
Twitter. But, I just want to say to the Christians that, that
Wherever this is going, I'm into it.
there is a wide, wonderful literary world beyond J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. That's what I'm.
Sure.
There's a lot
Just
more
that.
out there. That's just what I'm
No,
going to
they're
say.
great, but they're not
Yeah.
the end.
Yeah.
There's
that's-
other
that's
good
There
fiction
is-
written outside the mid
Yeah,
20th century.
yeah.
Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah.
I guess that's fair.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. That's a good answer.
Yeah, not to devalue those areas, but I
Right,
mean,
right.
I think you're right. Christians do.
Yeah, like Harry
tend to-
Potter, obviously.
Yeah.
Very enjoyable popcorn literature there.
Yeah. So do you divide reading for pleasure with reading for spiritual growth? And if you do, how do you balance it?
I will say there's no balance or organization to my reading whatsoever. So
That's fair.
there's a lot of reading that I have to do for teaching and for research and writing. So like I'm immersed in all of this, the Christian philosophy, theology stuff for something I'm writing. And so I'm reading a ton of that. And so then when I just really need to read something for fun, for me, for fun is still literature. So, I don't make any of those demands on myself. So I read because I just read so much. And so it's all good. And so, because of my work, I do read a lot more of the thick theology and philosophy and culture. And then it's more like, okay, I've got this one book going at night that I read for fun. So yeah,
Nice.
I mean, my it's my life. So there's so many demands on it that I just read what I have to read, but I like it all. So
Absolutely.
There you go. That's the joy of pursuing those things that you like to do and making a career out of it, right?
yeah, I mean, it's not something that I take for granted. I mean, 99.9% of human beings who have existed on this earth have not gotten paid to do what they love like that. So
That is a good reminder.
it's a great, it's just a great blessing. And there isn't a day that I want to take that for granted. So
Mhm.
That's awesome. Other joyful things in your life. I know you have a Weimaraner and a German short-haired pointer.
yeah,
Is that right?
that's pretty good. Yes.
Shout out.
Yeah.
Shout out to them. And tell us a little bit about them and your joy in them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm an animal person and a dog person. I just could not live without animals or dogs. And so we live in the country in an old house that we've fixed up, and my husband and I were never able to have children. So I, was able to carve out this career, I guess, and be a professor because I mean, I guess some women think they could do it all. I would not be one of those. So the Lord has just given me these other wonderful ways to serve the church and the world. And so we have the dogs are just sort of the delight, and they are really enjoying the pandemic because my husband's a school teacher, so he's back in school, but I'm home a lot more, and they just love that. So
They get you 24/7 now.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So it's just you just don't. To me, it's just once I figured out at some point probably in my early 20s when I had plans, I knew what I was going to do with my life and all this or that, and I just over a few years going to a good church, getting married, being discipled well, it was all surrendered to the Lord, and He has just it's just where He takes you and what He does with your life. It's not anything that I ever imagined or dreamed. It's better. And so I just encourage people to hold on to everything. My life verse is, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps.
Amen.
Plan and strive and be excellent, but let the Lord do what He's going to do with it. And that's He'll make better choices and direction than I could. So yeah, it's
excellent.
good. So I would say that's the hardest lesson that I learned, because I feel bad. I don't want to leave the question unanswered.
Okay.
So the hardest lesson I had to learn is to just let the Lord lead. So yeah.
That is a tough one.
No, yeah, we have our grand ideas, like you said. It's good to strive after. Like, God gave us hearts, God gave us wills and desires, and He made us all uniquely. So I don't think it's virtuous to ignore that, but also we want to make sure that we are allowing the Lord to lead us and not just being like, I've got my plans for me, and they're pretty great.
Yeah, and it's painful sometimes, but the Lord shapes those desires and says, hey, you have this one, but this isn't the way life is going to be, and this is the direction that I'm going to take, and you're going to trust me that it's good, right?
Well, and like you said, we often find 100% of the time, if we're being faithful and thoughtful,
and that's how He builds virtue.
That is the good. That is the best way that it could have gone.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one of the things we like to do, we've talked about a lot of books so far, and feel free to give some recent reads as well, but we like to do a segment called Substance Shoutouts. So anything you found encouraging, edifying, enjoyable recently, whether it's books, films, music, podcasts, things that you've consumed that you've found enjoyable or have stimulated your mind or spirit.
It's been a lot of books and a lot of COVID. Let me see. Recently, just my life has been very small and narrow, and I like it that way. Like every day, I do the same thing. Because before COVID, I love going to the movies and theater, and we haven't done that. So I'll just say, just before COVID hit, my husband and I went to see Hamilton.
Nice.
And now that the year mark of the pandemic is, I find myself kind of reflecting back on the things that we were, the last things I did.
It's already been a year. Man,
almost. And then that is a little bit more than a year. We saw Mumford and Sons in concert at the last minute, sort of spontaneous ticket. So that was fun. And we've been watching some Netflix series, but I don't know if it's uplifting.
Whatever you're comfortable putting out there. No, what have you been enjoying lately?
I think it's perfect for your podcast. We've been watching Dark. Are you familiar with it?
Oh. There's far too much content. I think I've heard of it. I feel like there's like a picture of some people in the woods. I've not watched it. I don't know anything about it.
What we got. Help us out.
It's German, and so you have to use the subtitles.
Okay.
But it is, and we're almost finished with it, so I want to reserve judgment. It is very dark, I will say that. But it's
well, they warned you.
It's very theological, like very like there are characters named Adam and Noah, and there's a Jonas who I can't figure out if he's Jesus or the Antichrist, but it's really grappling with theology from the Bible. Now which side it comes down on, I don't know, but it's really a mind bender because it's like sci-fi and time travel, but it really makes you think. So I'll just say that it makes you think.
I will add that to my eventual queue.
Very interesting. Wow. Nice.
Excellent.
Well, Karen, thanks so much. I know we're clocking in closer to an hour now.
Nice.
There's more, honestly, that I would love. We were going over some of the things that we wanted to talk about and having to painfully cut things. So there's definitely more that could be said, I'm sure. And we would direct all our listeners to check out On Reading Well and learn how to have virtue formed in you through the things that you read. And hopefully that people are reading the scriptures that way too. But thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you. It was a lovely conversation. I hope I didn't go on too long. You asked good questions.
Thank you.
Oh, I also wanted to give you plugged Jane Eyre. Is there anything else you want to plug or if you want to have people follow you, want to open up the floor for that as well.
I mean, again, I would just say, based on what we talked about here, for anyone who's, wants to read better or read more, this series, I have Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. And by the way, we talked about satire. Jane Austen is satire. It's not romance. Sense and Sensibility, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, another dark book. I really like the dark stuff.
I love that book.
So those,
I don't think I own it yet. Maybe I'll get that one.
Yeah, those are out, and I have introductions and discussion questions and annotations in those volumes. And then Jane Eyre and Frankenstein come out in March.
Wow.
And
maybe a church small group should go through that, huh?
Dude, I love Frankenstein and Heart of Darkness.
Get a taste
are
for
so
fiction.
Great.
Yes. Actually, I was just contacted by a church yesterday, a very large church that is doing a book club on using my edition of Frankenstein this spring. And
Nice.
it's really, any of these books would be great for a church small group or book club. So
for sure.
Yeah. Oh, and you can follow me at on Twitter at KS Pryor, or Instagram, where you can meet my dogs, Eva and Ruby, at Karen Swallow Pryor.
Excellent. We'll put those in the show notes.
That's so exciting. Thank you for the work and the great things that you're putting out, and the way that you are helping to shape the American Christian mind on literature in these kind of ways. And thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.
Well, that was Karen Swallow Pryor joining us to talk about virtue and literature and fiction and why it's important. And I hope that as you were listening to this, you got a bug to not just read the scientific stuff or the apologetic stuff or the theological stuff or the practical living stuff all the time, or just hopefully not even just always the news articles and stuff like that, but actually dig into some stories, some character, which will be an example, positively or negatively, virtue or vice, and help form characters. Good stuff, man.
No, that was very encouraging. If you enjoy that conversation and you want to hear more things like it, help support us as we're trying to just get more curated, high-quality content for you, you can become a regular supporter of The Substance on our Anchor link in the show notes. You can sign up at whatever monthly level you are comfortable with, whether it's just $1 or $2 a month or a little bit more if you're interested. Whatever you're comfortable with and can afford. Obviously, these are strange times, and we wouldn't want to say, hey, do anything more than you can. Not want to pressure you guys or anything, but would love it if anybody who signs up for that, that's always helpful. Or you can give single donations on Cash App. We are $ The Substance Pod there as well.
In addition to supporting us, you guys can also follow us. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Substance Pod. There you can engage with us. There you'll see our upcoming episodes, previous episodes, teasers for areas of the show that we really enjoyed, giveaways. So if you have comments or questions or thoughts, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are going to be the places to engage.
And I, old man Trevor, really love to contact The Substance through my landline at 913-703-3883. And then occasionally I do what those young whippersnappers do and send an electronic mail over by thesubstancepod@gmail.com.
Seeing Trevor go into a committed bit as a character was very exciting. Now, listeners, I wish this was I've never wished this was a video podcast more than right now. But yes, send us your
that whole thing, bro.
send us your emails and your phone calls, and old man Trevor will get back to you.
Oh gosh.
Well, that was weird, but thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time
on The Substance.
Peace.
Dope. That's very good.
Oh man,
That's very
Wait,
good.
are you keeping that?
Yeah, man.
For sure,
I'm
dude.
committed to that.
Well, after that,
Now I say thanks for joining us this week.